The crimson sky above Kepler 442b wept ash and fire as Commander Zixthak watched his forces crumble beneath the relentless assault of the Void Hunters. The crystalline formations that once served as natural fortifications now lay shattered across the battlefield, their luminescent fragments casting eerie shadows in the perpetual twilight of this dying world. Zixthak's forearms trembled as he gripped his plasma rifle, the weapon's energy core flickering dangerously low. Around him, the survivors of the Galactic Coalition's Fifth Fleet huddled behind makeshift barriers, their various species united only by the terror that gripped their hearts. The Altarians with their flowing tentacles pressed close to the ground, their bioluminescent patches dim with exhaustion. The insectoid Crexans clicked their mandibles in nervous rhythms, while their compound eyes tracked the approaching darkness. The Void Hunters moved like liquid shadow across the wasteland, their forms defying comprehension. They were not born of any world, but spawned from the spaces between stars where light had never touched. Their hunger was absolute, consuming not just flesh and bone but the very essence of life itself. Wherever they passed, the ground turned to dust and the air grew cold enough to freeze blood in living veins. "Status report," Zixthak commanded through his communicator, his voice barely steady despite his reputation as one of the Coalition's most decorated officers. "Sir, we've lost contact with Sectors 7 through 12, came the crackling response from Lieutenant Veltar, a young Saurian whose scales had turned pale with fear. "The Hunters broke through our eastern perimeter an hour ago. Estimated enemy forces." There was a pause filled with static. "Sir, I can't get an accurate count. They just keep coming." Zixthak closed his primary eyes and let his secondary pair scan the horizon. In the distance, he could see the twisted spires of the ancient city they were meant to protect. The civilian population had been evacuated 3 days ago, or so he hoped. Communications with the evacuation fleet had been cut when the Hunters deployed their reality-warping technology, turning space itself into a maze where rescue ships vanished without trace. The Coalition had fought these creatures before, across dozens of worlds in the Outer Rim. Every engagement had ended the same way: total annihilation of all defending forces. The Void Hunters seemed to grow stronger with each victory, as if feeding on the despair and fear of their enemies. Military analysts back at Central Command theorized that the creatures existed partially outside normal spacetime, making conventional weapons largely ineffective. A scream pierced the air as another defensive position fell. Zixthak watched helplessly as a squad of Aurelian warriors, each standing 8 feet tall and equipped with the finest armor their civilization could produce, were consumed by writhing tendrils of absolute darkness. Their plasma weapons fired desperately into the void, the energy bolt seeming to bend and twist before disappearing entirely. "Commander," whispered Sergeant Clix, a grizzled Viridian whose cybernetic implants sparked with damaged circuits. "The men are losing hope. They're saying this is the end." Zixthak understood their fear. He had fought in the War of Three Suns and survived the Plague Worlds campaign, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Void Hunters didn't just kill, they erased. Those consumed by their touch left no bodies, no memories, as if they had never existed at all. It was a death that transcended the physical, reaching into the realm of souls and dreams. The wind carried the sound of approaching terror, a low humming that seemed to resonate in the bones of every living creature on the battlefield. The remaining defenders, perhaps 300 souls from a force that had once numbered in the thousands, pressed together in their final moments. Species that had warred with each other for centuries now held each other close, finding comfort in shared mortality. "Sir?" Lieutenant Veltar's voice crackled through the comm again. "We're receiving a transmission. Long range from outside the system." Zixthak's heart skipped as he activated his personal receiver. Through the static and interference he heard something impossible, a voice speaking in the old trade language, calm and steady despite the chaos around them. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Terran Expeditionary Force. We've received your distress signal and are en route to your position. Hold your ground. Help is coming." The communication cut to silence, leaving Zixthak staring at his device in disbelief. Terrans? Humans? The species was legendary in Coalition space. Though few had ever seen one in person, they were said to come from a world of impossible violence, where evolution had forged them in fire and struggle. Most dismissed the stories as myth, tales told in spacer bars about the ghost warriors from the outer darkness. "Commander," Sergeant Clix asked, his voice barely audible above the growing drone of the approaching hunters. Did they say Terrans? Before Zixthak could respond, the sky erupted in light. Not the cold, dead radiance of the Void Hunters, but something warm and fierce. Contrails streaked across the crimson heavens as unknown vessels broke through the atmosphere at impossible speeds. The ships were smaller than Coalition frigates, angular and predatory in design, with hulls that seemed to drink in the dying light of Kepler 442b's star. The defenders watched in stunned silence as the human ships engaged the Void Hunters' aerial forces. Unlike Coalition vessels that relied on energy shields and evasive maneuvers, the Terran fighters dove straight into the heart of the enemy formation. Their weapons weren't the refined plasma cannons or particle beams preferred by civilized species, but something far more primitive and brutal. Kinetic projectiles that tore through the fabric of reality itself. For the first time in 3 days of constant retreat, the tide of battle shifted. The Void Hunters' advance slowed as they turned to face this new threat from the skies. Their writhing forms began to coalesce into more solid shapes, as if the presence of the humans forced them to acknowledge the laws of physics they had previously ignored. Zixthak felt something he had thought lost forever: hope. As the human ships screamed overhead, their engines leaving trails of fire in the darkening sky, he raised his weapon once more and shouted to his remaining forces, "Coalition forces, prepare for combat. Our allies have arrived." The final battle for Kepler 442b was about to begin, and for the first time since the nightmare started, victory seemed possible. The humans had come carrying with them the fury of a species that refused to yield to darkness, no matter how absolute it seemed. The first human to touch the ground of Kepler 442b did so with the force of a meteor strike. The drop pod's retro-thrusters fired at the last possible second, sending clouds of superheated steam rising from the impact crater. Through the dissipating vapor emerged a figure that defied every expectation the Coalition forces had harbored about their mysterious rescuers. Captain Sarah Chen stood barely 6 feet tall, her frame lean and compact compared to the towering Aurelians or the massive Crexans. Her armor was matte black, scarred and battle-worn, with no decorative elements or status indicators that marked the equipment of other species. What struck Commander Zixthak most profoundly were her eyes, dark brown orbs that held depths he couldn't fathom, as if they had witnessed horrors beyond imagination yet retained an unshakable resolve. "Status report," Chen said, her voice carrying easily across the battlefield despite speaking at conversational volume. She moved with fluid grace toward the Coalition's defensive positions, seemingly oblivious to the reality-warping distortions that made other species stumble and retch. Zixthak found himself stammering as he approached the human commander. "Captain Chen, thank the Void you've arrived. We've been under siege for 72 hours. The Hunters have consumed 14 of our 20 defensive positions. Current strength is approximately 300 effective combatants from an initial force of 4,000. Chen nodded, pulling a device from her belt that looked primitive compared to Coalition technology, a simple tablet with a cracked screen. She studied readings that meant nothing to Zixthak, while more drop pods screamed down from orbit. Each impact sent tremors through the ground, and with each arrival, the human presence on the battlefield grew stronger. "Void Hunters," Chen murmured, as if tasting the words. "We've encountered similar entities near the Proxima colonies. Different classification, same basic biology, reality parasites that feed on quantum consciousness." She looked up at Zixthak with those unsettling eyes. "You've done well to survive this long. Most species break after the first encounter." The ground began to vibrate with an ominous rhythm as the Void Hunters resumed their advance. The creatures had been momentarily disrupted by the human orbital strikes, but their alien intelligence was adapting. They flowed across the wasteland like a tide of living shadow, their forms constantly shifting between states of matter that shouldn't coexist. Chen raised her left hand, and suddenly every human on the battlefield moved in perfect synchronization. They formed a skirmish line that stretched across the Coalition's front, their spacing precise despite having never drilled together on this particular terrain. Each warrior carried weapons that looked almost crude by galactic standards: rifles with physical stocks, grenades with actual explosive charges, and blades forged from simple steel alloy. "All Coalition forces, fall back to secondary positions," Chen commanded. "Establish crossfire zones behind our line. Do not attempt to engage the Hunters directly until further orders." Sergeant Clicks moved close to Zixthack, his mechanical implants whirring with agitation. Commander, with respect to our new allies, this seems tactically unsound. The humans are placing themselves between us and a numerically superior force with reality manipulation capabilities. Before Zixthack could respond, the Void Hunters struck. They came not as an organized charge but as a wave of pure entropy. The air itself seemed to scream as they approached, reality bending and twisting in their wake. Coalition sensors went haywire, displaying impossible readings as the laws of physics became mere suggestions in the presence of these entities from beyond the veil. The human response was immediate and shocking in its simplicity. They opened fire with their primitive kinetic weapons, sending streams of solid projectiles into the advancing nightmare. What happened next defied everything the Coalition understood about engaging Void Hunters. The bullets struck home. Where energy weapons had bent and twisted uselessly, where plasma bolts had simply vanished into dimensional holes, the humans' crude ammunition tore through the creatures like they were made of paper. Black ichor sprayed across the battlefield as the hunters stumbled and shrieked, their forms solidifying under the impact of simple lead and steel. "Impossible," breathed Lieutenant Veltar. "How are their weapons effective?" Chen's voice carried clearly across the din of battle as she coordinated her troops. "Iron content disrupts their quantum coherence. They exist partially in our dimension and partially in quantum space. Basic atomic matter with high ferrous content creates a grounding effect." She raised her own rifle, a weapon that looked like it had been manufactured centuries ago by pre-spaceflight civilizations, and fired 3 precise shots into a hunter that had been reaching for a fallen Altarian soldier. The creature's form collapsed in on itself with a sound like reality tearing. The human advance was relentless and calculated. They moved in teams of 4, each member covering specific vectors while maintaining constant communication through what appeared to be simple radio transmissions. No quantum entanglement networks, no psionic links, just voice communications on primitive electromagnetic frequencies. What astounded the Coalition observers most was how the humans seemed to anticipate the hunters' reality-warping attacks. When the creatures attempted to phase shift behind the human lines, the Terran warriors were already turning to meet them. When the hunters tried to bend space to avoid incoming fire, the humans adjusted their aim as if they could see the distortions before they occurred. "How do they know?" Zixthack asked Chen as she reloaded her weapon with practiced efficiency. "Evolution," she replied, not taking her eyes off the battlefield. "Humans developed on a world where everything was trying to kill us. We learned to read micro-expressions, to spot the tells that indicate aggression, to sense when something wasn't quite right about our environment. These creatures may be from outside reality, but they still have to interact with our dimension to affect it. That interaction leaves traces. A massive hunter, easily 3 times the size of its brethren, materialized in the center of the human formation. Its presence warped space so severely that the ground beneath it began to flow like liquid. Coalition forces watched in horror as the monster raised what might have been arms toward the humans surrounding it. The response came from a human who couldn't have been more than 20 standard years old. Her face streaked with dirt, and her armor showing signs of recent combat. She pulled a cylindrical device from her belt, activated it with a simple twist, and hurled it directly at the creature's center mass. The explosion that followed was unlike anything in the Coalition's arsenal. It wasn't the clean energy release of plasma charges or the exotic matter disruption of quantum grenades. It was fire and smoke and concussive force, primitive and brutal and absolutely devastating. The massive hunter simply ceased to exist, its form scattered across 3 dimensions by the raw kinetic energy of the blast. As the smoke cleared, Captain Chen turned to Commander Zixthack with something that might have been a smile. "Tell your forces to advance. We're taking this planet back." The tide of battle had turned, but more importantly, the Coalition forces had witnessed something that would change their understanding of warfare forever. The humans had arrived not with superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but with something far more dangerous: the absolute refusal to accept defeat. The advance across the scarred landscape of Kepler 442b revealed the true scope of the Void Hunters' devastation. What had once been a thriving colonial world now resembled the surface of a dead moon. The creatures hadn't simply destroyed the settlements, they had unmade them, leaving behind spaces where matter itself seemed uncertain of its own existence. Sergeant Maria Santos knelt beside what had been a Crexan nursery complex, her scarred hands running over stones that phased in and out of visible spectrum. The human medic's dark eyes held a hardness that made even the battle-tested coalition veterans uncomfortable. She had seen 17 worlds fall to entities like these, had pulled survivors from wreckage that defied physics, had held dying soldiers whose last words were apologies for being unable to continue fighting. "The quantum signature is stabilizing," she reported to Captain Chen through her throat mic. "Whatever these things do to matter, it reverses after they're eliminated. Slowly, but it reverses." Chen nodded, watching as her troops established a perimeter around the ruins. The humans moved differently now that they were advancing, rather than defending. Where the coalition forces instinctively bunched together for mutual support, the Terrans spread out, each warrior covering impossible amounts of ground while maintaining perfect situational awareness. Commander Zixthak struggled to match the humans' pace. His forearms, evolved for the heavy gravity of his homeworld, seemed clumsy compared to the fluid efficiency of his allies. "Captain, our scouts report a major Void Hunter concentration approximately 2 kilometers northeast. Estimated strength suggests a breeding nexus." "Breeding nexus?" Chen's expression darkened. "These things reproduce?" Lieutenant Veltar provided the tactical briefing, his scaled hands trembling as he consulted his data pad. "Coalition xenobiology suggests the hunters create offspring by consuming sentient minds. Each absorbed consciousness becomes a seed for new entities. If they've established a nexus here, they could potentially birth thousands of new creatures." The human captain was quiet for a long moment, studying the tactical display on her primitive tablet. Around them, the combined force had grown to nearly 800 combatants as more coalition survivors emerged from hidden positions throughout the ruins. They looked to Chen with desperate hope. These warriors from a dozen different worlds who had seen their most advanced weapons fail against an enemy that existed partially outside reality. "How long does the breeding process take?" Chen asked. "Unknown," Zixthak admitted. "Coalition records show nexus sites discovered after Void Hunter victories, but never an active one. Every engagement has ended in total loss of defending forces." Chen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. To the coalition observers, it was barely noticeable, but her human subordinates recognized the expression immediately. Sergeant Santos moved closer to her captain, checking her weapons ammunition count without being asked. Corporal James Wright began distributing extra grenades to the squad leaders. These small actions rippled through the human forces like a silent communication network. "We're going to hit the Nexus," Chen announced, "hard and fast. No preliminary bombardment, no probing attacks. We go in with everything we have, and we don't stop until every last one of those things is dead." The coalition officers exchanged glances of barely concealed horror. Military doctrine across every known civilization emphasized careful preparation, overwhelming firepower applied at maximum range, and tactical flexibility. What Chen was proposing sounded like suicide. "Captain," Zixthak ventured carefully, "perhaps a more measured approach would be advisable. We could establish fire bases, coordinate with orbital support, perhaps attempt to isolate the Nexus before—" "No time," Chen interrupted. "Every minute we delay, more of these things spawn. Every hour we wait, the Nexus grows stronger. I've seen what happens when you give Void Hunters time to establish themselves fully." Her voice carried the weight of memories that had carved lines around her eyes despite her relatively young appearance. "Trust me, Commander. This is our only shot." The assault began at dawn, though the perpetual ash clouds made it difficult to distinguish day from night on the ravaged world. The human forces moved in a formation that appeared chaotic to coalition tactical doctrine, but revealed its genius as the battle unfolded. Small teams leapfrogged forward, each providing covering fire for the next while maintaining overlapping fields of observation. The first sign they were approaching the Nexus came when reality itself began to rebel against their presence. Gravity fluctuated wildly, causing coalition soldiers to stumble as their mass randomly doubled or halved. Colors inverted without warning, turning the landscape into a nightmarish negative image of itself. Sound began to precede cause, with gunfire echoes arriving before the weapons were actually fired. The humans pressed forward as if nothing had changed. Sergeant Santos found herself fighting beside a young Altarian engineer whose bioluminescent patches flickered with terror. The creature's tentacles writhed in distress as the space around them folded in impossible directions. "How do you stand it?" the alien asked in broken trade language. How do you function when the universe itself has gone mad? Santos's response was delivered while she systematically placed shots into a cluster of smaller hunters that had materialized from a dimensional rift. Kid, where I come from, the universe was always trying to kill us. This isn't any different from a Tuesday back home. The Nexus revealed itself as a structure that hurt to perceive directly. It existed in too many dimensions simultaneously, its surface writhing with half-formed creatures that hadn't yet achieved independent existence. The air around it sang with the screams of consumed minds, thousands of voices crying out in languages both familiar and utterly alien. Captain Chen raised her fist, bringing the entire assault force to a halt. Her expression was grim as she studied the Nexus through military-grade binoculars that looked ancient compared to Coalition optical enhancement systems. Thermal charges won't penetrate that reality distortion, she said to her squad leaders. We're going to have to get inside and place the explosives manually. The statement hung in the air like a death sentence. Getting close enough to the Nexus to plant charges meant entering the heart of the Void Hunter's dimensional manipulation field. Most species would lose cohesion at the cellular level within seconds of exposure. Ma'am, Corporal Wright said quietly. Thermal suits won't protect against quantum dissolution, Chen smiled. And for the first time since their arrival, Commander Zixthak truly understood why humans had become legends in Coalition space. It wasn't cruelty or sadism that made them so effective in combat. It was their absolute, unflinching acceptance of necessary sacrifice. I know, she said. That's why I'm going in alone. The protest from both human and Coalition forces was immediate and loud. Zixthak found himself arguing alongside Sergeant Santos, both demanding alternative strategies that wouldn't require their commander to walk into certain death. Chen listened patiently, then shouldered her pack filled with high explosive charges. This is what humans do, she said simply. When the galaxy needs someone to walk into hell, we volunteer, because if we don't, who will? Captain Sarah Chen moved through the reality distortion field surrounding the Void Hunter Nexus, like a woman walking through water. Each step required conscious effort as her body fought against physical laws that changed from moment to moment. The air tasted of copper and ozone, with an underlying sweetness that spoke of decay on a molecular level. Behind her, the combined human and Coalition forces maintained their perimeter, weapons trained on the writhing mass of the Nexus structure. Through her earpiece, she could hear Sergeant Santos coordinating defensive positions with Commander Zixthak, their voices strained with the knowledge that this mission was likely one way. Thermal readings are off the charts, reported Corporal Wright from his position 200 meters back. Captain, the field strength is increasing as you get closer. We're losing telemetry on your suit sensors. Chen checked her equipment one final time. The explosive charges strapped to her back were simple chemical compounds, primitive by galactic standards but unaffected by the quantum distortions that rendered energy weapons useless. Her rifle carried its last magazine of iron core rounds, each bullet hand-loaded by the armorer aboard her ship with the meticulous care of a craftsman preparing tools for sacred work. Copy that, right? Maintain radio contact as long as possible. If communications go dark, wait exactly 10 minutes, then withdraw all forces to the secondary evacuation point. She didn't mention what everyone already knew. If she failed to destroy the Nexus, there would be nowhere left to evacuate to. The quantum signature readings suggested the structure was approaching critical mass. Within hours, it would birth enough Void Hunters to overwhelm not just this world, but potentially the entire sector. The first Void Hunter emerged from the Nexus wall when Chen was still 50 meters away. Unlike the creatures they had fought on the battlefield, this one was fully formed, its reality-warping abilities focused and deliberate. It stood nearly 3 meters tall, its form suggesting a humanoid shape wrapped in living shadow. When it spoke, the words arrived directly in Chen's mind without passing through her ears. You are the one who brings iron death to our children, the creature said. We taste your thoughts, small flesh thing. You burn with the fire that consumes stars. Chen raised her rifle and put 3 rounds center mass into the entity. The iron core bullets struck with satisfying impacts, each one causing the creature's form to solidify slightly. Black ichor sprayed across the ground, hissing where it landed. Yeah, well, she replied aloud, knowing the creature could understand her thoughts anyway. That's what happens when you mess with Earth's children. The hunter staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it began to duplicate itself, spawning identical copies that surrounded Chen in a loose circle. She had encountered this behavior before during the Proxima campaign. The creatures could split their consciousness across multiple forms when threatened, making them exponentially more dangerous. Chen pulled her first grenade, activated the timer, and smiled. Good thing I brought enough for everyone. The explosion scattered the duplicate forms like leaves in a hurricane. The blast wave carried Chen forward several meters, her armor absorbing most of the impact while her inner ear struggled to maintain equilibrium in the constantly shifting gravity field. She rolled to her feet and continued toward the Nexus, ignoring the warm trickle of blood running down her face from where her helmet's edge had cut her forehead. The Nexus loomed above her now, its surface crawling with partially formed hunters in various stages of development. She could see faces in the writhing mass. Coalition soldiers who had been consumed during the initial attack, their features twisted into expressions of eternal agony. Some she recognized from the personnel files she had studied during the journey to Kepler 442b. "You cannot unmake what has already been born," whispered a voice that might have belonged to Commander Thelvas, the Saurian officer who had led the planet's original defense. "We are eternal. We are the hunger that devours light itself." Chen reached the base of the Nexus and began placing her charges with practiced efficiency. Each explosive device was positioned at what her tactical analysis suggested were structural weak points, though the geometry of the structure defied conventional understanding. The surface felt warm and alive under her gloved hands, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded her uncomfortably of a heartbeat. 2 charges placed, she reported, though static was beginning to interfere with her communications. Moving to the primary support matrix. The climb up the Nexus exterior was like ascending a living mountain. The surface provided handholds that appeared just where she needed them, as if the structure was cooperating with her ascent. Chen recognized the trap for what it was. The Nexus wanted her inside, where it could absorb her consciousness and add her knowledge to its growing collective. Through breaks in the static, she could hear the sounds of battle from the perimeter. The Void Hunters were launching a massive assault, trying to prevent her from completing her mission. She could picture the scene without seeing it. Coalition forces and human troops standing shoulder to shoulder, pouring fire into an enemy that existed only partially in their dimension. "Chen to all units," she broadcast, hoping some part of her transmission would get through. "Whatever happens, do not attempt extraction. Complete the mission, that's an order." At the Nexus's midpoint, she encountered something that stopped her cold. Embedded in the structure's surface was the face of a human child, perfectly preserved but clearly part of the alien mass. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that transcended death itself. Chen knelt beside the embedded figure, her tactical training warring with her human emotions. The child's lips moved soundlessly, forming words that Chen could lip-read despite the alien context. "Help me." "I'm sorry, baby," Chen whispered, placing her hand gently on the child's forehead. The surface was warm and soft, indistinguishable from human flesh except for the wrongness that radiated from it. "I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." She placed the 3rd charge directly beside the embedded face, then continued her climb. The Nexus seemed to sense her growing proximity to its core, and the reality distortions intensified. Colors that had no names painted themselves across her vision. Sounds that predated the formation of matter itself echoed through dimensions she couldn't perceive. At the apex of the structure, Chen found what she had been looking for, the quantum focal point where the Nexus drew its power from the spaces between realities. It appeared as a sphere of absolute darkness, so perfectly black that it seemed to pull light from the surrounding area. Staring at it was like looking into the eye of entropy itself. The final charges went around the sphere in a careful pattern. Chen had only one shot at this. If the explosives failed to disrupt the quantum matrix, the Nexus would become completely unstable and potentially tear a permanent hole in reality itself. The entire system could be consumed, creating an expanding zone of void that would devour everything in its path. As she worked, the voices of the consumed grew louder and more insistent. They pleaded with her to stop, promising that death was preferable to the limbo they experienced within the Nexus. They threatened her with fates worse than extinction. They offered her power beyond imagination if she would only join them willingly. Chen ignored them all and activated the final timer. 10 minutes to detonation. More than enough time to get clear if she ran immediately. Instead, she sat down beside the sphere of darkness and pulled out a worn photograph from her chest pocket. The image showed a small house on Earth surrounded by trees that had never known the touch of alien sun. In front of the house stood a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, flanked by two children who shared Chen's stubborn jaw and determined expression. "This is for them," she said to the Nexus, to the consumed voices, to the universe itself, for everyone who gets to wake up tomorrow, because these things won't be there to take them. The timer displayed 8 minutes and counting as Sarah Chen prepared to make the final sacrifice that would save a world she had never seen before arriving to defend it. The explosion that consumed the Void Hunter Nexus could be seen from orbit. When the charges detonated, they didn't simply destroy the structure, they unraveled it across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The quantum focal point collapsed in on itself, creating a localized implosion that pulled the writhing mass of partially formed hunters back into whatever realm had spawned them. Commander Zixthak watched the light fade from behind his protective visor, his 4 hearts beating in a regular rhythm as the reality around them stabilized for the first time in days. The constant pressure that had weighed on his mind, the whispers at the edge of perception, the sense that existence itself was under threat, all of it vanished in the wake of the explosion. Sergeant Santos lowered her binoculars with hands that trembled despite her years of combat experience. Around the perimeter, human and coalition forces stood in stunned silence as the immediate area returned to something resembling normal physics. Colors resumed their proper hues. Gravity settled into a consistent downward pull. The air stopped tasting of metal and despair. "Captain Chen." "Report," Santos called into her communicator, though they all knew no response would come. The Nexus site was now a crater filled with glass that had been fused from the surrounding sand. In the center, where the quantum focal point had existed, space itself seemed cleaner somehow, as if the very atoms were grateful to resume their proper behavior. There was no trace of Captain Sarah Chen or the dozens of explosive charges she had carried into the heart of the alien structure. Lieutenant Veltar was the first to break the silence. "The quantum disturbance readings have returned to baseline levels. Void Hunter life signs across the planet are fading rapidly. It appears the destruction of the Nexus has severed their connection to this reality." Corporal Wright nodded grimly as he monitored communications channels. "All human units report successful elimination of remaining hunters in their sectors. The creatures are destabilizing without the Nexus to anchor them." Zixthak approached Sergeant Santos, unsure how to express what he was feeling. In coalition culture, tactical losses were analyzed, documented, and filed away as learning experiences for future engagements. But Captain Chen's sacrifice seemed to demand something more, a recognition that transcended military protocol. "Sergeant," he began carefully, "your captain saved not just this world but potentially dozens of others. The Nexus would have spawned enough hunters to overrun entire star systems. Her sacrifice—" "Wasn't a sacrifice," Santos interrupted, her voice steady despite the grief in her eyes. "It was just Tuesday for her. Another job that needed doing, another threat that needed to be ended." "That's what humans do, Commander. We show up, we do what needs to be done, and we don't ask for anything in return except the chance to keep doing it." The cleanup of Kepler 442b took 3 standard days. Coalition engineering teams worked alongside human technicians to restore power to the surviving settlements and begin the long process of rebuilding what the Void Hunters had destroyed. The humans approached this task with the same methodical efficiency they had shown in combat, treating reconstruction as just another form of warfare against entropy and despair. On the second day, while cataloging salvageable equipment in the ruins of the primary spaceport, Commander Zixthak discovered something that would change his understanding of humanity forever, hidden in a sealed storage locker that had somehow survived the Void Hunter. Assault was a collection of personal items, belonging to the various coalition personnel who had been stationed on the planet. Among them was a datapad, belonging to Commander Thelvis, the Saurian officer whose voice Zixthak had heard emerging from the Nexus. The pad's final entry was a personal log recorded just hours before the Hunter's initial attack. "Personal log, Commander Thelvis, day 47 of our deployment to Kepler 442b. Received word today that the humans have agreed to provide military advisors for our Outer Rim Defense Initiative. The Council was reluctant to accept their offer. There are still those who remember the stories from the contact wars when Earth first emerged from isolation. They say humans are too violent, too unpredictable, too willing to sacrifice themselves for causes that don't directly benefit their species. I disagree. I've reviewed their tactical reports from the Proxima colonies and the Beta Centauri incident. Yes, they fight with a brutality that makes our warriors uncomfortable. Yes, they use weapons that civilized species abandoned centuries ago. But in every engagement, they have placed the protection of non-human civilians above their own survival. They are not violent because they enjoy destruction. They are violent because they understand that sometimes violence is the only language that evil comprehends. The humans call it paying the iron price. They believe that freedom, safety, and peace can only be maintained through the willingness to fight for them, not just to pay others to fight, not just to support from a distance, but to personally stand in harm's way when darkness threatens those who cannot protect themselves. I pray we never need to test their resolve. But if the day comes when our civilization faces extinction, I know exactly whom I would want standing beside us. Zixthak read the entry 3 times before the full weight of its implications settled in his mind. Commander Thelvas had understood something about humanity that the rest of the coalition was only beginning to grasp. They weren't mercenaries or berserkers or any of the other labels that had been applied to them over the years. They were guardians, shaped by evolution and history into beings who could do what others could not or would not do. That evening, as the human forces prepared to depart Kepler 442b, Sergeant Santos approached Zixthak with a small metal container. Inside was a handful of ash mixed with fragments of fused glass from the Nexus crater. "Standard human protocol," she explained. "When we can't recover remains, we take something from the place where they fell. Captain Chen will go into the memorial gardens on Luna, alongside every other human who died defending people they'd never met." Zixthak accepted the container with the reverence due to a sacred relic. "Sergeant, if I may ask, how many worlds has your species saved?" Santos considered the question for a long moment. "Honestly, we stopped counting after the first 100. It's not about the numbers, Commander. It's about making sure that when children go to sleep at night, they don't have to worry about monsters in the dark, because we've already dealt with the monsters." The final human transport lifted off from Kepler 442b as the system's primary star painted the sky in shades of gold and amber. Coalition personnel lined the observation decks to watch their departure, offering salutes that crossed the boundaries of species and military tradition. In the cargo holds of the human vessels were detailed reports on void hunter tactics, countermeasures, and weaknesses, information freely shared with their allies. Zixthak stood alone on the command tower's observation deck, watching the human ships disappear into hyperspace. In his hands, he held both the container of ash and a communication device that displayed a message from Terran High Command. "Coalition Force Commander Zixthak, Captain, Chen's final report has been received and processed. Tactical analysis confirms that Nexus destruction should prevent Void Hunter manifestation in this sector for approximately 50 standard years. Human expeditionary forces remain on standby should assistance be required elsewhere. Remember, you are not alone in the dark. Admiral Marcus Webb, Terran Defense Force." As night fell over the recovering world, Zixthak composed his own report to Coalition Command. In it, he recommended immediate approval for expanded human military cooperation and the establishment of joint training protocols. He also included a personal addendum that would become part of official Coalition military doctrine. "The humans do not fight like us. They do not think like us. They do not value the same things we value. But when evil comes calling and civilization hangs by a thread, there is no species in the galaxy I would rather have standing watch. They are what they have always been. The thin line between order and chaos, between hope and despair, between the light and the endless dark that wants to consume us all." The message was transmitted that night across Coalition space, carrying with it the story of Kepler 442b and the captain who walked into hell to save a world she had never seen before. It would be read in the halls of power on 100 different worlds, by beings whose children would grow up free because a human named Sarah Chen had decided that their safety was worth her life. The legend of humanity's iron resolve had grown by one more chapter, written in blood and fire and the unshakable conviction that some things are worth dying for. 3 months after the Battle of Kepler 442b, the story had spread across Coalition space like wildfire. In the cantinas of Rigel Station, Grizzled spacers traded embellished accounts of the human captain who had walked into a reality storm to save an alien world. On the academic platforms orbiting Vega Prime, xenobiologists debated the implications of humanity's unique resistance to quantum-based entities. In the grand chambers of the Coalition Council, politicians argued over how to formally recognize the debt owed to a species that asked for nothing in return. Commander Zixthak found himself at the center of these discussions, his first-hand account carrying weight that transcended his military rank. He had been summoned to testify before the full council, a gathering of representatives from 47 different species that met only during times of galactic crisis. The chamber was a marvel of engineering, with atmospheric controls that allowed beings from radically different biospheres to coexist in the same space. "Commander," spoke Matriarch Velthara of the Altarian Collective, her bioluminescent patches pulsing in formal patterns. "Your report describes humans as possessing capabilities that seem to contradict established xenobiological principles. How do you account for their apparent immunity to quantum dissolution effects?" Zixthak had wrestled with this question for weeks. The scientific implications of what he had witnessed challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness and reality. "Honorable Matriarch, I believe the answer lies not in their biology but in their psychology. Humans evolved on a world where survival required constant adaptation to threats that defied prediction. Their minds developed a flexibility that allows them to function even when the rules of existence itself become uncertain." High Chancellor Mordock of the Crexan Empire clicked his mandibles in skepticism. "Psychological adaptation cannot explain resistance to molecular dissolution. There must be some physiological component we are overlooking." "With respect, Chancellor," Zixthak replied, "I have observed human warriors maintain combat effectiveness while standing in zones where space-time itself was fluctuating. Their secret is not immunity to these effects, but the ability to continue functioning despite experiencing them. They feel the same terror that would paralyze our troops, but they act anyway." The debate continued for hours, with each species attempting to understand humanity through the lens of their own evolutionary experience. The ethereal confederacy representatives, beings of pure energy who existed primarily in quantum states, were particularly intrigued by humanity's apparent ability to force quantum entities into fixed patterns through will alone. "Perhaps," suggested Prime Resonance Kethmore, their voice a harmony of electromagnetic frequencies, "the humans possess what your people might call an aggressive relationship with uncertainty. Where most consciousness seeks stability and predictable patterns, theirs thrives on chaos and adapts to impossibility." Dr. Elena Vasquez, the human xenopsychologist who had been invited to provide expert testimony, nodded thoughtfully. She was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that held the same unshakable calm Zixthak had observed in Captain Chen. "In human culture, we have a saying, necessity is the mother of invention. Our species learned long ago that survival sometimes requires doing things that seem impossible. We call it thinking outside the box, the ability to abandon conventional approaches when conventional approaches fail." "But the psychological cost," interjected Dr. Thelmaran of the Saurian Medical Corps. "Our analysis of human combat veterans shows trauma patterns that would be considered pathological in any other species. How do you reconcile your people's effectiveness with the apparent damage it inflicts on individual psyches?" Dr. Vasquez's expression grew somber. "We don't reconcile it, Doctor. We accept it as the price of being who we are. Every human who stands in harm's way to protect others carries scars that never fully heal. We have learned to function with that damage, to find meaning in suffering, to transform pain into purpose. It's not healthy by galactic standards, but it's effective." The testimony session was interrupted by an urgent communication from the Coalition's early warning network. Emergency klaxons echoed through the chamber as Admiral Korthanas of the Aurelian Navy stood to deliver a briefing that sent chills through every representative present. "Honored Council, our deep space monitoring stations have detected quantum distortions consistent with Void Hunter manifestation in the Tau Ceti system. Initial reports indicate a massive incursion, possibly involving multiple nexus sites. The colonial population is approximately 12 million beings across 6 inhabited worlds." The chamber erupted in panicked discussion. Tau Ceti was one of the Coalition's most prosperous systems, home to thriving communities from dozens of species. The idea of 12 million souls facing the horror that had nearly consumed Kepler 442b was almost too terrible to contemplate. "What are our response options?" demanded Chancellor Mordock. Admiral Corthanus consulted his tactical display with grim efficiency. "The nearest coalition fleet is 72 hours away at maximum hyperspace velocity. By the time they arrive, the hunters will have had ample time to establish multiple breeding nexuses. Conservative estimates suggest we would need a force 10 times larger than what we have available to have any hope of success." Dr. Vasquez stood slowly, her movement drawing the attention of the entire assembly. "Admiral, what about human forces? Are there any Terran ships in the area?" "Negative, Doctor. The nearest human military assets are—" The Admiral paused, checking his readings. "Wait, I'm receiving an updated report. The Terran Expeditionary Force ship Iron Will is currently en route to Tau Ceti. Estimated arrival time is 14 hours ahead of our main fleet." Zixthak felt his secondary heart skip a beat. One human ship against a system-wide Void Hunter incursion was not just hopeless. It was a form of suicide that defied rational analysis. Yet, as he looked at Dr. Vasquez's face, he saw no surprise, only a mixture of pride and sorrow that spoke of long familiarity with such scenarios. "How many crew aboard the Iron Will?" asked Matriarch Velthara. 347 personnel, the Admiral replied. "Standard human expeditionary complement includes Marines, engineers, medical staff, and civilian specialists. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. 300 humans against an enemy that had consumed entire star systems. The council chamber fell silent as every representative contemplated the same terrible calculus. "They know they cannot win," whispered Prime Resonance Kethmore, their harmonic voice filled with something approaching awe. "Yet they go anyway," Dr. Vasquez nodded. "That's what humans do, Prime Resonance. We show up, we buy time. We hold the line until help arrives even when we know help might not be enough. The crew of the Iron Will isn't planning to save 12 million people. They're planning to give those people a few more hours of life. A few more moments with their loved ones, a chance for rescue that wouldn't exist otherwise." She paused, looking around the chamber at faces that represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization. Every human aboard that ship volunteered for this duty, knowing that someday they might face exactly this situation. They signed up to be the people who stand between the darkness and everyone else. Regardless of species, regardless of the odds, regardless of the cost. Chancellor Mordock's mechanical voice processors struggled to convey the emotion in his words. "They are either the bravest beings in the galaxy or the most foolish." "Both," Dr. Vasquez replied with a sad smile. "Definitely both." As the council session dissolved into emergency planning committees and crisis management protocols, Zixthak found himself staring at the tactical display showing the Tau Ceti system. Somewhere in that distant constellation of light, 347 humans were preparing to face an enemy that existed beyond the boundaries of rational fear. They would fight with primitive weapons and indomitable will, buying time measured in hours and paid for in blood. The galaxy was about to witness another chapter in humanity's ongoing war against the dark, written by people whose names would never. Captain Marcus Webb stood on the bridge of the Iron Will as his ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Tau Ceti system. The tactical display before him painted a picture of devastation that made even his battle-hardened crew fall silent. 6 worlds burning with the cold fire of quantum dissolution. Space itself rippled with reality storms as dozens of Void Hunter nexuses poured their nightmarish spawn into normal spacetime. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Commander Sarah Cross, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. "I'm reading 43 separate nexus sites across the system. Void Hunter numbers are beyond our sensors' ability to accurately count. The outer colonies have gone dark. We're detecting some survivors in the inner system, but they're completely cut off." Webb nodded, his weathered hands steady on the command console. At 57, he was old for an expeditionary force captain, his hair silver and his face lined with scars from a dozen different campaigns. He had fought Void Hunters before in the Proxima colonies and at Beta Centauri. He knew exactly what his crew was volunteering to face. "Communications. Patch me through to the ship-wide address system." The comm officer nodded, and Webb's voice echoed through every compartment of the Iron Will. In the Marine barracks, soldiers checked their weapons one final time. In engineering, technicians ran diagnostics on systems they knew would be pushed beyond design limits. In the medical bay, doctors prepared for casualties that might not even exist in traditional physical terms. Crew of the Iron Will, this is the captain. You've all seen the tactical reports. You know what we're heading into. I'm not going to lie to you about our chances or dress this up as anything other than what it is. We are 347 people facing an enemy that has consumed entire star systems. The mathematics are not in our favor. He paused, watching through the bridge's main viewport as reality itself writhed and twisted around the distant nexus sites. But mathematics have never stopped humans before. When our ancestors faced predators that were bigger, stronger, and better adapted for survival, they didn't calculate odds. They picked up rocks and fought anyway. When our species first reached for the stars, everyone said the distances were too vast, the challenges too great, the risks too terrible. We did it anyway. In the depths of the ship, Master Sergeant Diana Price listened to the captain's words while distributing ammunition to her Marines. Each round was hand-loaded with iron cores, blessed by chaplains from a dozen different human faiths, and inscribed with names of fallen comrades. She had served with Captain Webb for 8 years, following him from one impossible battle to another. He had never asked his crew to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Today, we face an enemy that exists partially outside reality itself, Webb continued, an enemy that feeds on fear and despair, that grows stronger with every world it consumes. The Coalition fleet is 72 hours away. The survivors in this system don't have 72 hours. They have whatever time we can buy them, paid for with whatever price we're willing to pay. Dr. Michael Chen, no relation to the captain who had died at Kepler 442b, but carrying her legacy in his medical kit, prepared surgical equipment that might need to operate on wounds that transcended physical dimensions. The human body's response to quantum dissolution was still poorly understood, but he had developed treatments that worked through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that some injuries were beyond healing. I won't order anyone to participate in this mission, Webb said, his voice carrying across the ship. Anyone who wants to transfer to a shuttle and head for Coalition space has my permission and my understanding. There's no shame in recognizing when the odds are insurmountable. The response was immediate and unanimous. Every department head reported full complement, ready for action. No one had requested transfer. No one had even hesitated. Very well, Webb said, and those who knew him could hear the pride in his voice. Then let's remind the universe why humans don't calculate odds. All stations prepare for combat. We're going in. The Iron Will was not the largest ship in space nor the most advanced. She was a converted exploration vessel, retrofitted with weapons that most species considered obsolete, and shields that relied on brute force rather than elegant energy manipulation. But as she accelerated toward the heart of the Tau Ceti system, she carried something that no amount of advanced technology could replicate, the absolute certainty that some fights were worth fighting regardless of the outcome. The first Void Hunters to engage the human ship discovered what their brethren at Kepler 442b had learned too late. Iron core projectiles didn't bend reality around them or disappear into dimensional holes. They struck with the simple, implacable force of physics, tearing through quantum entities that had never encountered anything so primitive and effective. Target the nexus sites on Tau Ceti 4, Webb ordered. If we can collapse even one of them, we might buy the evacuation fleet enough time to reach the inner colonies. The Iron Will dove through a reality storm that would have torn apart ships with more sophisticated shielding. Her crude armor held through pure stubbornness, while her crew worked with the mechanical precision of people who had trained for exactly this scenario. They didn't fight with the elegant tactics of advanced civilizations. They fought like humans had always fought, with whatever they had for as long as they could, until either the enemy was dead or they were. Master Sergeant Price led the first boarding action against a nexus site, her Marines moving through spaces where up and down had become arbitrary concepts. They placed their explosive charges with the same methodical care their ancestors had used to plant crops, turning the art of destruction into an act of love for those they would never meet. Dr. Chen treated wounds that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, his surgical instruments guided not by advanced scanners, but by the simple human intuition that life was worth preserving regardless of how complex the threat to it became. He saved beings whose names he couldn't pronounce, whose physiology he barely understood, because saving them was what humans did. Lieutenant Commander Cross coordinated the ship's defense while reality warped around them. Her tactical decisions based not on computer models, but on the hard-earned experience of fighting enemies that existed beyond the reach of conventional strategy. She kept the iron will fighting long after any rational analysis would have declared the situation hopeless. One by one, the Nexus sites fell. Not all of them. The iron will didn't have enough firepower or personnel to eliminate every threat in the system. But each destroyed Nexus was time-bought, lives saved, hope preserved for the arrival of the Coalition fleet. When the rescue ships finally arrived, they found the Iron Will still fighting, still holding the line despite suffering damage that should have destroyed her 3 times over. Captain Webb was at his post, coordinating the evacuation of survivors from the inner colonies, while his ship served as a shield between them and the remaining Void Hunters. The final tally was sobering and magnificent in equal measure. 11 million people evacuated successfully, 37 Nexus sites destroyed, 1 human ship and her crew standing, against the dark until the very last civilian transport had reached safety. Admiral Korthanas of the Coalition, Navy found Captain Webb on the bridge of the Iron Will as medical teams treated the human crew for injuries that defied classification. The Aurelian officer had commanded fleets in a dozen major campaigns, but he had never seen anything quite like what the humans had accomplished. Captain Webb, he said formally, on behalf of the Coalition Council and the 11 million beings who live because of your actions, I offer the gratitude of the galaxy. Webb looked up from his damage reports, his face streaked with blood and exhaustion, but his eyes still sharp. Just doing our job, Admiral. Someone had to hold the line. Your job? Korthanas asked. Captain, you faced impossible odds with no hope of victory. You sacrificed your ship and crew for people you had never met, of species that are not your own. How do you call that simply doing your job? Webb was quiet for a moment, looking out at the tactical display that showed Coalition ships moving through the system, beginning the long process of cleaning up the remaining Void Hunter presence. Admiral, humans learned a long time ago that the universe is a hostile place. It will kill you without malice, consume you without hatred, forget you without regret. The only thing standing between civilization and the dark is people willing to stand in harm's way. He gestured to his crew, working to repair their battered ship with the same dedication they had shown in combat. We volunteer for that duty not because we enjoy violence or seek glory, but because someone has to do it. And if we don't, who will? The Admiral had no answer to that question. None of the advanced species of the Coalition did. They had built their civilizations on the assumption that reason and technology could solve any problem, that sufficient resources and careful planning could eliminate any threat. Humans had built their civilization on a different assumption that some problems could only be solved by people willing to walk into hell with their eyes wide open, knowing they might not come back but going anyway because the